Thanks so much to Cochrane for allowing me and Sarah to present at this Method Support Unit web clinic. Sorry, we postponed an earlier slot in the spring, I think it was. And morning to all who've been able to join us who are not on holiday as yet. So, first of all, what is this FAME and why do we need it? I'm saying, how can we use it to improve Cochrane reviews? But why do we need it in the first place? Haven't we got a decent enough way of doing aggregate data reviews already? I think it's worth remembering that whenever we do a sort of standard systematic review or meta-analysis of aggregate data, it's retrospective. And it's retrospective in the sense that they tend to be initiated once most or all eligible trials have already published. And so it's really difficult in planning the review and meta-analysis for the methods not to be influenced by the knowledge of trial results. And as you well know, often we are still relying on published information for our systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And that tends to limit the data that we have in power, but it also limits the types of analysis that we can do. It means that there's always the potential for more than one or more reporting biases. It can be difficult for us to get standard definitions of, for example, outcomes and subgroups across trials. So that can make it difficult to combine them, or at least to interpret the results. And because we're not involved with the trialists often who are doing these trials, we're relying on the protocols and the publications to give us knowledge of the trials, and that's sometimes unclear, and it can make, for example, risk of bias assessments difficult, as well as interpretation of the final results. And I think if the focus is on published information, then the meta-analysis results aren't always placed in the context of all the available evidence. So though quick to do and often very good quality, they are not always as reliable as they could be, I think. So even meta-analysis of individual participant data, which is often coined the gold standard of systematic review, they're also retrospective. You also start those often when most of the trials are already published. And so again, the methods can be influenced by knowledge of trial results. In this case, there is a collaboration with trialists, and of course you have to collaborate with trialists in order to get their trial data from them. So IPD meta-analysis, for those of you who don't know, involve the central collection and reanalysis of data from all the trials that are relevant, all the participants, all the outcomes, and so on. So it's a much more detailed way of doing things. And in collecting the data, we tend to request or at least derive standardized definitions of, for example, outcomes and subgroups across the trials. So not only are we getting more data, we're getting data that's more similar across trials. When you've got data at the individual patient level, you can do much more detailed and flexible analyses, and you're not limited to what the trialists themselves have done. And I think what IPD are particularly noted for is the ability to do subgroup analysis at the patient level. Of course, because you've got access to trialists and you've got access to IPD, you've got better knowledge of the trials, for example, for risk of bias assessments, but also for interpretation and so on. And it's kind of standard in IPD meta-analysis to be aware of all the trials, whether they're published or not. So even if you don't get data from trials, you tend to interpret the results in the context of all the potential evidence. So that tends to go as standard. So, but great though they are and very impactful they have been over the last sort of almost 30 years, they still are resource intensive and they still take a long time. There's still a time lag between the trials publishing results and the availability of IPD. It's really only prospective meta-analysis that start at an earlier time frame. So they tend to start before trials have produced results, often while trials are still ongoing. So it's really the one approach where the systematic review and the meta-analysis methods aren't influenced by the trial results. There's still a collaboration with trialists, and that's to get the data that you need. So because these tend to be based on IPD, sorry, I should have said that. Most commonly prospective meta-analysis are based on IPD. So you collaborate with trialists and get all of the gains of the IPD approach that I've just mentioned. But the downside again is that they are resource intensive and slow. And in fact, prospective meta-analysis of IPD are perhaps more resource intensive than the retrospective type. So what do we do about this situation? We have many more trials now, I think, than we had when Cochrane started, even in the last 10 years, I would say. Some healthcare areas are moving very rapidly. And so we need something that's much more responsive to that. And so what we wanted to do was, can we take the different elements from prospective meta-analysis, from IPD meta-analysis, and do a better job of aggregate data meta-analysis? So could we start earlier and be more prospective in an approach? Could we collaborate with investigators to understand the trials and get better data? Could we monitor what was going on in trials and then anticipate, the ideal time for a reliable meta-analysis, and that ideal time being as early as possible? And so this sort of thinking and these elements of the different types we see here are the basis of our framework for prospective and adaptive meta-analysis of aggregate data, known as FAME. Now, we've developed FAME. I mean, it wasn't ideal at the beginning, but we've kind of developed it over time. And really these principles, which are shown here in brief, are the sort of culmination of our experience doing these mainly in prostate cancer, but also in other areas. So it is about starting early while trials are ongoing or yet to report, so without knowledge of trial results. It's about liaising with trialists to get more info on trials. And it's that allows you to start thinking, when can I do my meta-analysis? When in the future can I do my meta-analysis? How early can I do it and still make it reliable? And once you've done that part, you start to develop the protocol and plan to collect the detailed data. And because you know about all the trials, whether they're unpublished or not, you can interpret that data, the results, in the context of all the potential evidence. So it's really, I always think it's taken us a long time to understand FAME ourselves, if that makes sense, is because it has evolved, and it's really hard to sort of disentangle the different bits and what the advantages are and exactly how it operates. So I thought I'd use a hypothetical example, a sort of idealized hypothetical example at first to just take you through these principles. So we want to start early. We've started early. We're relying on trial registers to find trials at this point. And we've identified 5 trials that you see here that started recruitment between 2010 and about 2012. And what you can see in orange is that the planned recruitment period for each of those trials, and you see the number of participants that they planned. So you see they're all happening in slightly different time frames. And that there's 2 that have actually completed recruitment but haven't produced results, and there are 3, which are trials 2, 4, and 5, that are still recruiting patients. So importantly, at this point, we don't have any results of the individual trials. So let's move forward to a year forward. We've started to liaise with trialists to get more information. And what I mean by that is more information about the trial design and conduct. Where are you at with your accrual? How is the data maturing? What's your analysis and reporting plan? So we're starting to build up this more detailed picture of what's going on in the individual trials. So now we know in purple there that we've got 3 trials completed their recruitment and are in follow-up. And the 2 trials at the bottom, trials 4 and 5, are still recruiting patients. Sorry, I can't see my little boxes at the bottom because of my my toolbar for Zoom. Okay, so trials 4 and 5 are still ongoing and will report much later than the other 2, or the other 3, sorry. Now, trials 1 to 3 recruit 2,700 patients between them, and trials 4 and 5 are still aiming for 400. this is the information that we can use to start to think, when can we do a reliable and definitive meta-analysis, and how early can we do it? And this is actually based on an idea from the early days of meta-analysis. The notion being is what you need is enough information, and not the optimal information size, in order to have a reliable meta-analysis. So we kind of look at these 5 trials as if they were one trial, and we look at the information accumulated, and we look at sample size calculations, sample size methods, and see, do we think we're going to have enough power from the data to do a reliable meta-analysis? So it's a bit like when you have a trial that hasn't produced its final results, you're monitoring the data in order to understand when's the timing of the final analysis. So it's very much like that. And we can use the information on the number of participants in the trials, if we have it, event rates, if we have it, what are typical control group event rates, what are typical effects of treatment. So my scroll thing's not working, that's it. So we've got our 5 trials, we know we've got 2,700 patients from 1 to 3, and that would provide sufficient power. That's what we've estimated from our sample size calculations. Also, these 3 trials would represent 87% of eligible participants, and so actually quite a big proportion. And so that means that we would feel comfortable doing a meta-analysis of these 3 trials and not wait what looks like is going to be quite a lot of years before we have the results of trials 4 and 5. So it looks like they won't report until beyond 2016. Because we know we have power and a large proportion of the evidence, we feel comfortable doing that. It would be pretty unlikely for those 2 small trials, 4 and 5, to overturn the results of the meta-analysis. So at this point, we're developing the protocol, we're putting in our plans for the meta-analysis, and we're starting to decide what data is that we need to collect, both baseline data, risk of bias, information-informed risk of bias, and all the trials, outcomes, participant data that we need in order to answer the questions. And the thing that has evolved over the reviews that we've done, I think at the beginning, we were quite tentative, and we just collected the 2 main outcomes. But as time's gone on, we've started to be more ambitious and collect more and more data, and you'll see the culmination of that later. So imagine in this hypothetical meta-analysis, we didn't have a clear treatment effect from those trials 1 to 3, and it turns out that the remaining trials recruited fewer participants. So it ends up our meta-analysis actually based on 92% of eligible participants. So even less likely that those trials 4 and 5 would overturn the results. So we're all, in interpreting our meta-analysis, we can also think, well, is there value in updating? And from what we have so far, it seems that there's little value in going and collecting aggregate data from those trials or doing any kind of individual participant data meta-analysis. I'm just going to pause there because I know that's a lot to take in. So what I wanted to do now is show you a few examples where we've used all the FAME principles, mainly in prostate cancer. So take this first example. How did we predict the earliest timing of reliable meta-analysis? Well, we started in 2016 and identified 3 eligible trials. 2 had results due in 2017. And both individually and together were well powered. So these trials were in follow-up. So we didn't have any results yet, but they individually were well powered and together were well powered. So the meta-analysis would be 2. Together they represented about 70% of the men randomized. So not ideal. You know, I think we would want a larger percentage of patients. But given that the 3rd trial didn't have results due until 2022, was it reasonable to wait 5 years to add that in? And we've done this in the past. You know, we always want the completeness of the data. But in fact, if we've got the power and we've got a large proportion of the eligible men, then we felt it was reasonable to target the meta-analysis for 2018, I think it was. as it turned out, we couldn't have known this, but as it turned out, individually, those trials were powered well enough for what turned out to be a very large benefit of abiraterone for advanced prostate cancer. But what we were able to do was show consistency of that effect across the trials and across a lot of outcomes. But for this particular example, the toxicity of abiraterone was a concern, but the trials were analysing that data in different ways. So what we did was we requested that they gave us the toxicity data in a way that was compatible across trials. And that's what allowed us to establish that, yes, indeed, there were some serious harms associated with the use of abiraterone. But at least that there were, and we could see what those were, but at least that there weren't any, there wasn't any excess of mortality as far as we could see, based on the data supplied. So again, thinking about how we predict the timing of reliable meta-analysis, let's turn to another example, looking at the effects of prostate radiotherapy for advanced prostate cancer. So this time in early 2018, we identified 3 trials, 2 with results due later that year. And together these provided adequate power, and they actually represented about 90% of the main randomized. It was a similar situation. The final trial didn't have results due to 2022, partly because it's the same trial, which was a factorial design that looked at radiotherapy and abiraterone. So again, we felt it was much more important to get that early answer and it to look like it was going to be a reliable answer rather than wait for the results of the 3rd trial. What was interesting with this example is there wasn't an overall effect, there wasn't an overall benefit of prostate radiotherapy, but we had collected some results by patient subgroup, and one of them was by the number of bone metastases. Now, the 2 trials classified bone metastases in quite different ways, but we were able to get the data from them so that we could get a compromise with a cut point at less than 5 or greater than or equal to 5 bone metastases. And this was really important because what we found was that the effects of prostate radiotherapy, benefits of prostate radiotherapy, were confined to men with few bone metastases. And I don't know if you're familiar with these interaction plots, but the results were very consistent across trials and across outcomes. So that really added quite a lot of weight to this analysis. So there's some additional gains accruing as we went about data harmonization and getting subgroup data and toxicity data. So we're able to get much more data than we'd originally thought and tentatively asked for. And this is quite a different example in that there were really quite big benefits to the ongoing trials. So this is a much earlier stage of prostate cancer. It takes a long time to run the trials and it takes a long time for events to accrue. So we actually started this way pre-FAME. A radicals trial, it's an early prostate cancer. We're struggling to recruit men. The men were doing a lot better than we'd anticipated at the design stage. And it was similar for these other trials. It was taking a very long time to do the trials. IDMCs were questioning whether they should continue. But it was a very important question about whether they should give radiotherapy up front after a man's had his prostate removed or wait until he progresses. So the original plan was an IPD prospective meta-analysis. But as time went on and we started to develop FAME, we thought, actually, we can do this with FAME. And what we decided to do was look at an earlier outcome. We thought it was still going to take a very long time, even with a meta-analysis, to get results about the definitive outcome. So let's do an earlier outcome and just see what's happening, because a lot of men are getting this immediate radiotherapy and there's a lot of nasty side effects associated with it. So what this prospective and collaborative approach helped with was with continued recruitment. The trialists could justify to their IDMCs and to their funders. It gave us a forum to discuss, what this early outcome should be and how to define it with trialists. and also the opportunity to more reliably answer the key questions. I mean, that this is an ongoing collaboration. And what we were able to find is absolutely no evidence that immediate radiotherapy improved the outcomes for men with early prostate cancer. And that result means that, you know, those men can be spared that treatment and not have these awful side effects until they need the treatment. And a sort of coup that we had here was, you know, this was a really important result from the trials and from the meta-analysis. And so we spoke to Elsevier and persuaded them, or helped persuade them, to publish all the trials and the meta-analysis on the same day in Lancet and Lancet Oncology. And the other advantage to the trials is that the JETUG 17 trial, which was smaller and less well-powered, would have gone to another journal. It would never have got in this quite prestigious journal. So it really benefited that trial, and it meant all the evidence was in the same place and could have the impact that it deserved. So as well as our initial plan to have timely and reliable meta-analysis, you can see that there were additional gains that we managed to pick up along the way. You know, we requested harmonized data, we requested subgroup data and toxicity data. So we were actually expanding the amount of data that we were asking for, and that meant that we could do much more with it. We were also getting access to pre-publication results. In that previous example, we couldn't have done that had they not given us their results prior to publishing their individual trials. So as they were doing their trial analysis, we were grabbing results from them in order to do the meta-analysis, so that we could coordinate the publication of the trials and the meta-analysis together. And I think that is a major benefit of the approach, if you can pull it off. You won't be able to do that every time, but we were able to do it in a couple of occasions. And as I've already said, that there was an additional gain for the trials that were included in that particular meta-analysis. You know, it helped them to justify funding for follow-up, for continuation of the trials, and also to their IDMCs. So I imagine that you're sitting there going, yeah, well, that's all prostate cancer, and it's, you know, some of the trials are your own trials. These are long-term trials. You've got time to plan. And plus you've only got a few trials in each meta-analysis. And you'd be absolutely right in thinking that did make it easier for us. And it did mean that we had time to develop the methods and build up collaborations in the prostate cancer community. So you're absolutely right. But this sort of approach has been used in other contexts, and I'd like to share that with you. So fast forward to early 2021 and the second wave of the COVID pandemic. And the WHO had set up this REACT team to do a series of prospective meta-analysis of aggregate data. And we were invited to assist by colleagues in Bristol who were key to doing these prospective meta-analysis. And although it wasn't FAME in the sense that we had described it, it pretty much, these prospective meta-analysis pretty much used the majority of the principles, and really demonstrated the value of a collaborative and prospective approach to aggregate data meta-analysis in spades. I mean, this is quite an incredible story. And I've cherry-picked this one, the effects of anti-IL-6 agents for very sick patients hospitalised with COVID-19. So established collaborations with all the investigators with help from WHO, and persuaded them, 27 trials from 28 countries, to provide data, aggregate data for the meta-analysis. But it wasn't the sort of things that I've just been describing. It was baseline information, it was information for risk of bias, it was results for 11 outcomes across these trials, and it was results by 7 subgroups for some of these outcomes. So it's a huge amount of data and a huge effort. And honestly, this is a tiny bit of the sort of data that was being collected, but it's just to sort of show you an example of, you know, it was multiple spreadsheets asking for multiple different types of data across those 28, 27, or is it 28 trials? And it was an absolutely huge and sort of humbling collaborative effort, really, because these were clinicians providing data while also running trials in the front line of the pandemic. I mean, it was quite incredible. And it showed that anti-IL-6 agents reduced 28-day mortality, particularly when they were given with corticosteroids. The effect was consistent across most outcomes in subgroups. And all of those results fed into the Living Network meta-analysis that was happening at the time, and also into the WHO guideline. And the prospective meta-analysis and the guideline, it was coordinated so that they were published on the same day. So incredibly, incredibly powerful stuff. Now, that was a very, very particular context, and everybody was motivated to do it and to get it right and to get answers for these very sick patients. But is it feasible in other contexts? Is it feasible for your situation? Is it feasible for other situations that we might come across? Excuse me. Well, Sarah and I and others have been thinking about this, and even speaking to Toby as well. What we think is, even if you can't apply all of the principles of FAME, if you apply 1, 2, 3, or 4 of those, you're going to improve the quality of your aggregate data meta-analysis. So just for example, say you do the starting early bit, get ahead of time and look for trials where they're ongoing or yet to report. Now, I think many of you have been involved in COVID-19 reviews. Many of you are involved in Living reviews, will be more familiar or maybe doing this sort of thing already. So why not start early and get to know your trials? Even if you don't do it with trialists, get as much information as you can on those trials when they're likely to complete and report. And at least if you know all the trials and you know about them before they complete and report, you can start to plan your meta-analysis for when those results do come out, rather than waiting for results to be published and then start looking then. And a really important thing that I think doesn't always get done, so I'm sure many of you do search for ongoing and unreported trials, but what we've noticed is that sometimes those aren't taken into account when you're interpreting the results. And I think that would be, even that in itself would be a huge shift in the quality of aggregate data meta-analysis. So I think these are things that could cut across many Cochrane reviews. Something that's maybe a bit more difficult and absolutely does rely on collaboration with trialists is to not the developing, registering the protocol, but seeking such detailed and harmonised aggregate data. I'm sure, again, some of you do get data from trialists to inform risk bias assessments and maybe get some results too. But this is the gain that's absolutely huge. You saw it there in the COVID-19 meta-analysis. I think Peter, who's on the call, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there was only, when they did the meta-analysis, there was only 8 trials or something that had actually published results. So if they hadn't gone to the trialists, it would have been an empty meta-analysis, to be honest. So the gains of going to trialists and seeking detail and harmonised aggregate data is just huge. It gets around the limitations of your meta-analysis, it increases power, it gives you a more comprehensive assessment of treatment effects, it's easier to interpret, the results might be more generalised. But I mean, I think this gain is huge. So if it's possible, even if it's possible for 1 or 2 trials in your meta-analysis that are particularly limited on data, that's going to improve things. If you can do it across the board, even better. So really today is about, think about whether you can do 1 or more of these principles and really make a difference to your aggregate data reviews. So I'm going to show you an example again of prostate cancer about sort of using this FAME-lite approach. And it was because we came to this particular question really quite late. This is an earlier stage prostate cancer, looking at the duration of hormone therapy that men get. And you can see, yeah, we came to it very late. So 2 trials, the RTOG trial there and JETUG AFU16, so the 2 top trials were already long since completed and published. Our radicals trial and the RTOG trial were about to produce results in the same year. So we really had to get our skates on with this one because we still wanted to be as prospective as possible. We wanted to do what we could before the trial results came out, and we wanted to be ready for those trial results coming out. So we quickly established the collaboration, prepared the protocol, and started to collect the necessary data. And so that we could present the results at the same time as these two yet to report trials. So what did we collect? We collected information to inform risk of bias. So we're doing this not just for the trials that haven't yet published, we're doing it for those older trials too. So we're trying to improve the data across the board. So we're collecting extra outcomes for the published trials, harmonising the definitions across trials, because if we relied on what was published, that wouldn't be the case. And we also wanted to collect subgroup results because there wasn't much subgroup information already out there. And we wanted to collect the results for radicals trial pre-publication, which is easier because it's one of our unit trials. But just to show you what a sort of contrast there is between what we would have had from the publication. So this is just the main outcomes. You know, what we would have had if we hadn't collected results, you know, so really about 50% of the information. But even more stark is what we would have got if we were relying on published subgroup results. So really, we wouldn't been able to do much in the way of subgroup analysis. So a huge improvement in the amount of data that was available by going to the trialists. And the ones that are still in red there are just ones that they didn't collect. Oh my goodness, I've reached the end before I expected to, so I must have been speaking at 100 miles an hour. So apologies for that, but we've got lots of time for questions. So just finally, you know, many of you will be involved in living systematic reviews, which is a mechanism for sort of continually updating reviews. And it's just to sort of realise that FAME is starting that bit further back and is aiming to produce a single, reliable and thorough and timely meta-analysis result. So at one time point, you know, there may occasionally be times where we would update, but that's the overarching aim. And we do recognise that it may not be feasible for every Cochrane review for every situation. And that's why I do think that the elements of FAME-lite could improve the quality of many Cochrane reviews. You know, if you just dipped your toe in FAME and picked up a few of the principles, it could make a big difference. We had intended to do a workshop at the colloquium to explore the barriers and you know, to get people in the room from different healthcare areas, find out what the barriers might be and you know, enable, you know, have a discussion with you about how we might resolve some of the issues. But instead we've been asked to do an oral presentation, so a short oral. So what we're going to do is after Cochrane and the dust settles around that, then we're going to do a workshop anyway. So we'll run that from CTU either in person or as a sort of web workshop, a bit like this. I'm sure there are barriers and I'm sure there are issues and challenges around the sort of Cochrane setup, and Sarah's got a few slides in that if we need to cover them. But I think for now I'd like to you know, open up to questions so that we can sort of dig in a bit more to the detail of FAME and how it might work for Cochrane.